Hey everybody, it is Mike Schumann of the Daily Hoosier here for another episode of East 17th Street. I am joined by the full team today of the Daily Hoosier. Seth Towers with me, along with Owen Graham. Owen, welcome back. It's been a while, man.
Returned.
I think we got to get some priorities straight here. Podcast before class. What's going on?
Sorry, man. It's the long week hiatus of bouncing class, school, and media and work all at the same time. Coming down with the flu or some type of sickness that's hitting Bloomington all at the same time. It's been a rough couple of weeks, but we're back, and I'm glad to
Yeah,
be back.
seems to be a lot of the flu going around and a lot of people not following through on their media obligations going around. We'll circle back to that a little bit later. But as Seth and I talked about last week, we want to kind of start to get together weekly to, as long as there's a coaching search going on, to kind of just touch base, share our thoughts, what we're hearing, all that fun stuff. And I think as every IU basketball coaching search has to begin with, we got to start by talking about Brad Stevens, because that was the hot topic when we last spoke, Seth. I think that was on Thursday, if not Wednesday of last week. And then news broke on Friday via Jeff Goodman that Brad Stevens was happy in his position with the Boston Celtics, and not interested in the IU basketball opening. It's kind of a weird thing to put out there, because to my knowledge, Brad Stevens doesn't have to do media, doesn't really have to say anything publicly. Seth, why do you think he even felt compelled at the time to have that put out there via Goodman?
I mean, it's easy to see that maybe becoming a distraction to the Celtics, if that just continues to linger around the public discourse, social media and all that. It's easy to see that, if it's not put to bed, just becoming a distraction within the locker room in Boston. The fan base in Boston, I'm sure, would start to get a little nervous if nothing was come out and said. So, that it seems like the reasonable logic to me.
Yeah, and Owen, the buzz was clear in the days before that came out, at least in the circles that I'm in and people I talk to, that he was the hot topic by a mile. I'm curious, like, student population, was it kind of the same way? Was it all Brad Stevens and nobody wanted to talk about anything else?
Yeah. Students are weird, especially when they're on Twitter. You'll just see, like, under one tweet is like, I'm hearing this about Brad Stevens, and all the comments are just Brad, and that's it.
Yeah.
Just like comments and comments of just the word Brad. So, I mean, the buzz was definitely there. And I think, his name is always going to get thrown out with like IU coaching searches every year that they'll have one. But the students, I mean, you could tell, like, everyone just hopped on the Brad train, didn't really pay attention to any other candidates until that news broke out. And then it was straight on to Dusty May, which of course we'll probably get into earlier, but is another complicated, route to try to navigate if they try to go that way. But the Brad hype has definitely gone down now that that news broke.
Yeah, if that was the goal, to quiet down that noise, that was certainly mission accomplished. I mean, Seth, I think we talked last time that, like, it was almost like a carbon copy of 4 years ago with the Brad mania, until something came out to finally quiet it down. Do you have any reason to believe it's gonna result in anything different this time around?
I mean, I had people even before that asking me, how realistic I thought. And I probably said it on this podcast that even if you think it's more plausible than it was the last time, you probably don't want to get your hopes up about this right now. Right. And I mean, so I don't really see any reason for that to change. If he comes out and, not that it couldn't change, but if he comes out and says, I'm happy with the Celtics, I'm not interested in coaching at IU. I have no reason to believe that that's going to change, unless he's flat out lying in this statement, which I'm not accusing anybody of, but
Right.
That's the only way it changes. And so I have no reason to believe it's going to.
Yeah, I mean, certainly if you go back through the annals of coaching searches, there have been stranger things that have happened where people have said they're not interested and then they get hired, later. Yeah. So some of the same people I talked to that were Brad Mania a week ago are still Brad Leavers out there. they think that this was a smoke screen, and that, you know, it was just to do what did actually happen, was to quiet the noise, but they still think it's going to happen. So I don't know.
Might want to keep workshopping that one.
We might need a support group for some of those people.
But Brad Leavers.
Yes, that term has been texted to my phone more than once.
Oh, goodness.
So for
they
all
might
the Brad,
they might need a Brad.
Yeah, I think we could go on for a long time with this. But it, you know, I think when that news came out on Friday, you know, for whatever the motives or reasons behind it, the one thing it clearly did was just quiet down not just the Brad Stevens noise, but really all the noise in the coaching search. And it kind of caused me to stop and realize that, you know, this thing's going to take a long time now as things stand. And unless there's some other coach out there, like a retired coach, you know, I know Dick Vitale floated the name Tony Bennett earlier this week, which is another hard one to
playing
believe.
All the greatest hits right now.
Yeah. And that's what seems to happen every 4 years with Indiana. But unless there's somebody else out there like that, I mean, every other current coach is, you know, you'd like to think is going to be coaching into the NCAA tournament, which, you know, just looking at some dates here, you know, the Big Ten tournament starts the week of March 10th. Selection Sunday is March 16th. The Final Four is April 5th. So, you know, we're talking 3-4 weeks before we probably get any real traction, any real noise, potentially, because, you know, these coaches really can't talk to anybody until their seasons are over. So, you know, Seth, I think we talked about this a little bit, you know, a while back, but what is somebody like Scott Dolson doing over the next 3 weeks? What's he spending most of his time doing in preparation for when things do kind of open up?
Continuing to get things organized on the back end of everything, you know, just organize, you know, and some of that, like we had said before, some of that had already surely been happening before anything was announced about Woodson,
Right.
but just kind of getting everything organized with the search, how they want to run the search, you know, identifying the top candidates, putting out some feelers here and there. While he can't directly talk to coaches involved in this until their seasons are over, you know, you can still find ways to put some feelers out there with people in their camp, or, you know, friend of a friend or something like that. And just to kind of gauge some interest, to run a more efficient search when that time really starts. It's probably just things like that. And look, let's not also forget, this isn't the only thing that Scott Dolson is doing right now.
That's
I mean,
right.
he just, you know, he did just bring in a women's soccer coach too. It's easy to forget when there's a big high profile a search like this, a big high profile story like this, to forget that there's other things that he's also spending his time on. But
you mean he's not locked in his basement right now?
Believe it or not, no.
Okay.
And so, but as far as the basketball search, yeah, I think it's just kind of getting everything in order, you know, identifying who the top candidates are, putting some feelers out there, and also probably working internally with the university, just, you know, not just for the athletic department, but at large, you know, this is the type of candidate that we want. This is what we're going to be able to offer. You know, he may need to be working out what they're really able to offer certain candidates, which could, you know, what they are able to offer Brad Stevens may differ from what they're able to offer somebody else. And so, you know, there's just a lot of little things that he is probably getting in order right now for when that time comes, when he's able to kind of, you know, when it's going to go from 0 to 100.
Yeah, and I think it's going to be interesting. I mentioned kind of the key dates and the timeline. You know, all the coaches that, you know, are on our hot board are going to be in the NCAA tournament, and, you know, it's going to be interesting to kind of track fan sentiment through the early portion of the NCAA tournament. It's going to feel like every game is a referendum on the coaching search. Like, oh my God, I can't believe, you know, Mick Cronin's out in the first round. We would never take him, and so
that's
on.
already
And so
happening. I mean, UCLA just lost to Minnesota, and you already see like fan comments online, and you already see chatter, you know, with every passing day, every game about, you know, these coaches that are involved.
I was going to point that out. Twitter went not very in favor of Cronin after he lost that game. And it's, I mean, that kind of stuff happens. So with the NCAA tournament, it only grows bigger.
Shouldn't the coaching search at this point just stop and start with Ben Johnson? I mean, he beat Dusty May, he beat Nick Cronin. I mean, come on, what else, what other data points do we need?
Hey, if that's what the fans want, I guess.
Seth, I know
you. I've told you before. I think Ben Johnson's a good coach. He gets the most out of those teams. He's not a realistic candidate for Indiana, but I mean, it's so hard to win up at Minnesota, and he clearly is not working with the resources that you need to build a winner in the modern college basketball. But it's hard to say that he hasn't gotten the most out of his teams the last couple of years.
I think that's totally fair, and I think kind of along those lines, Richard Pitino, like, I'm kind of surprised he's not getting any buzz for the Indiana job because he's killing it right now. And, you know, if you follow that same sentiment that it's just really freaking hard to win at Minnesota, then, and, you know, he's got that family tree. If people can really get behind the fact that he can be as good as his dad, I don't know, maybe there's a sneaky name to put on your hot board if this thing gets a little weird and goes longer than people think it does.
Yeah, I mean, it's possible.
It might not even need to be a weird name.
Yeah. All right. Well, we'll wrap it up right there. Richard Pitino it is.
There's your next head coach.
You heard it here first, people. Let's talk about some names. Owen, you and I sat there and listened to Mick Cronin give a lengthy press conference in Bloomington after the game on Friday night. First of all, like, how refreshing is it to sit and listen to an actual coach, you know, share authentic thoughts and not just get canned responses for 6 minutes. Yeah, it seems like each game in Bloomington and elsewhere is like a dichotomy of those two things. But what was your kind of sense listening to him talk? He seemed very authentic in his thoughts about, you know, being a candidate, you know, where he stands at UCLA, which turned out to be really interesting.
Yeah.
He said he was on the hot board to be fired at UCLA, you know, like 3 days before he lost at home to Minnesota. But, you know, leaving that aside, you know, what was your reaction? Yeah, at its very best. But Owen, what was your reaction to listening to him on Friday?
I thought he was sharp. The main thing that stood out to me was he, you know, really was good at just conversating about the game, especially, but also just with all the rumor stuff. He obviously, you know, he's going to get asked like, oh, have you thought about IU, stuff like that. Like you said, he kind of dodged the question a little bit, right. But he was like, oh, I might be on the hot boards at UCLA, whatever. That also happens. But overall, just you can tell he's got a really good knowledge of the game. He works the media room well. It's kind of a weird comparison, but I kind of thought to him as a little bit of like a Bryant Haynes, but not as energetic, if that makes any sense. Just really nice, like really good with his words and like putting out his like whatever he was talking about well. I thought he was sharp. He's definitely a candidate to watch out for, I think, just because, you know, IU gauges a lot of interest, and I think he has the chance if IU wants to try to make that move that he could be one of those final guys that they look at. But overall, I liked our time with him. I think he cracked a few jokes, which was funny. I always appreciate that, but he was a good guy. Yeah.
Yeah, he's clearly comfortable in his own skin. You could definitely pick that out. You're clearly becoming a connoisseur of coaches. You know, we've sent you over there all season to cover the other coach, so you've clearly picked up the intricacies of how they all go about it. Mm-hmm. You know, Seth, you did a lengthy piece on Scott Drew this week. What jumped out to you when you dug into his profile a little bit more?
I mean, he's like I said, I actually got it wrong. I realized I got it wrong on the podcast last week. I said there were only 5 coaches that had won a national championship, and I realized I got that number wrong, and there were 6. I think I forgot John Calipari on the podcast last week. So, whoops.
That's okay. But we can forget about him.
Yeah. But Scott Drew is one of those 6 who's won a national championship, and that's not nothing. Right. And of those 6, he's the only candidate who's even somewhat realistic as a candidate for IU in this cycle, whether for whatever other reasons those other candidates are unrealistic. It's really Scott Drew is the only name of those 6 that's realistic.
Right.
But it's not just the one banner. First off, he walked into a program at Baylor that was an absolute mess. They faced a version of the death penalty there. I mean, one of his second or third season, they were only allowed to play conference games, no non-conference games. They were on probation, scholarship, restrictions. Because the whole big Baylor murder scandal that went down, that he just inherited an absolute mess of a program. And, it took him 4 years to really get, overcome all that. But in the 17 years since then, he's taken a Baylor program without much history to its name before then and turned them into a really consistent winner. I think in those 17 years, he's only had like 2 seasons under 20 wins, something like that. And he's well on his way to getting there again this year. That's the level of success that you want in an IU basketball coach. There's the detractors of, he did have his own sanctions and transgressions while he was at Baylor too. He got suspended for a couple. He got suspended for a couple of Big 12 games. I think it was like 2012 or 2013 for some recruiting violations. And, it's not like that's popped back up again. Obviously there could be more under the surface that just wasn't really made public. But, so there, I think it's fair to say, IU has been down that road before of bringing somebody in who had past violations. Would they want to risk doing that again? Obviously, it's been more than a decade since that went down for Scott Drew. So, you can judge for yourself whether you think it's that's just who he is as a coach, or if he's kind of righted the ship or whatever. And everybody, I'm not saying that people are wrong if they think that, he did that in the past. We can't have that type of guy at IU. I don't think that's a wrong opinion necessarily, but that's something to keep in mind with him. And it's all, and there's the other aspect of, Scott Drew turned down Kentucky last year, like very publicly turned down Kentucky. And that kind of begs the question, if he turned down Kentucky, is there any job that he's going to go for? Maybe if he thought the IU job might open this year and this was the job that he's been holding out for all this time, then, maybe that's the one. But it seems like, whatever job he has in his head, if it's not just staying at Baylor for the rest of his career, he clearly would just have one job in his head. Like, this is my dream job. This is the one thing I would leave Baylor for. Because otherwise he is happy enough at Baylor to have turned down what I assume was a pretty good offer from Kentucky.
Right. Yeah. One thing I've learned or at least been reminded of over the last couple of weeks is that, these conversations are very emotional for the fans, and you bring up things like, checkered past, I'd say Drew's is probably relatively minor, guys like Chris Beard, not so relatively minor. People in the Drew case were commenting on your article, it even has a tie into Indiana because one of the assistant coaches at the time, Hannah Mascara-Perea, was being recruited. And I think it was because he was leaning towards Indiana. They actually a Baylor assistant texted to Perea or his guide person he was living with in the U.S. or whoever that they were going to send him back to Columbia. And like that text, made it, to the public via FOIA or however it made it. So people connect Drew to that situation even. So it becomes very personal with a lot of these things. And I'm seeing a lot of comments on the site and social media and elsewhere, like it can't be Drew for this, it can't be Beard for this, and on and on and on, which, I get that people are emotional about it, and it'll be interesting we'll probably never find out how Scott Dolson views some of this stuff, but I do think it's becoming clear that some of these guys, it's going to be too much to overcome. Probably in the case of Chris Beard and a few others, where it's just like, do you really is it really worth the risk to do your diligence? I mean, don't forget, Indiana thought they did their diligence in 2006 and had it come back and bite them 2 years later and completely wreck the program. So it's not like, there's not already a history of doing something like that. So I just don't think there's any appetite to do it.
Yeah, and to your point, also, I think I said it last week. I don't think there's going to be anybody Indiana could bring in that would satisfy every single person in
No.
Bloomington, every
No.
fan. I think even if they got Brad Stevens, I think there would be some
Yeah.
people that would, like I said, point to his not having been on a college sideline in over a decade, and ask some reasonable questions. And I think there's no perfect candidate. There's a lot of very quality candidates and people who could get the job done, but I don't think there's anybody they could bring in that would, I don't think there's anybody they could bring in that would satisfy everybody.
Yeah, and to the point about Stevens, like 4 years ago, I don't think I saw anybody question him for any reason, but I certainly saw people raising, and you raised, and others, that he's been out of the game for 12 years at the college level, and look how much has changed at college in that time. So it is a legit question. The guy who's clearly probably got the least questions from fans, that's still a legitimate candidate, at least ostensibly legitimate, is Dusty May. And this is something I think I asked you, Seth, when we were waiting for the game to tip the other day, is, just wondering aloud, like, he's already got a very complicated situation, because I can't think of a guy that, made a move within the conference after 1 year, that had as much success at school one as he's had. Like, if he wins the Big Ten this year, like, is there I can't think of a scenario where a guy has won a conference and then after 1 year and then flip to another school within the same conference. The only reason he would even consider it is because he's an IU guy. Like, nobody would be talking about Dusty May going to, Illinois or Wisconsin or name your other school. So it's just a very unique situation. But I guess for either of you guys, like, do you think if he wins the Big Ten and then goes on a big run in the NCAA, does that like complicate things even further? It kind of feels like it does for me, but I obviously have no idea what's in his head.
I'd have to agree with you. I can't see a world where, like you said, he gets to his Big Ten school year one, a lot of like really great players on the roster, have a really successful season, potentially win the Big Ten, potentially make a deep run in the NCAA tournament, and just throw that all the way for what could be his dream job. It probably is.
Yeah, I think we said last time, I don't think he's ever said that, but we kind of assume that it is.
Right.
I'm not sure that's fair.
Yeah, but I mean, it just doesn't seem like it would be a scenario that would play out, in my mind at least. I think, I mean, I'm pretty actually positive that Michigan's probably going to make the NCAA tournament very comfortably, and is near the top of the Big Ten. Even if they don't even make a deep run into the NCAA tournament, there's still a very, very good possibility. He wants to run it back with the guys that he has bringing in with recruiting and stuff like that. Maybe he already has momentum in the transfer portal. There's a lot of logistics to it, but it doesn't. I can't really see a world with looking at it right now too, like with how well Michigan's been doing. I really just don't see a scenario play out where he would make his way over to IU if they continue to have success this season.
Seth, did any precedent come to mind when I mentioned that, like a conference jump like that?
No, I can't think of, and I'm, there's only so much that I can remember up in this little brain. So
come on, you're young. You guys are supposed to be the young heads on this podcast.
I can pull out a lot of random trivia. I'm not saying, but I can't think of anybody like that. Look, to what Owen was saying about the player base. I mean, in the modern era of college athletics, if he wants to leave Michigan and come to Indiana, it would not be hard for him to shift over the recruits he was bringing to Ann Arbor and have them come to Bloomington and bring players over from the transfer portal. I mean, that's just the name of the game at this point in college athletics. I don't think that's necessarily a detractor. It just ultimately comes down to, it's hard to say, whether or not that this is his dream job, but that's ultimately all it really is if this is the job he really had his heart set on, and this is the job that, deep down, this is what he wants, where he wants to be, what he wants to do, then he can find a way to make that happen. And I'm not sure. I think a run, a deep March run for Michigan, I mean, it complicates it maybe a little bit, but probably more only externally. I'm not sure that it changes anything, with it, for Dusty May. I think it changes things probably for Michigan, because I'm sure the fan base then gets louder about wanting to make sure they keep him in town. And, I mean, there was already a report that the athletic department's working on a new contract for Dusty May. Those, talks, I'm sure, would grow louder, the more that Michigan keeps winning. So that's, I think, the level of complication of it. But it ultimately still will just come down to if this is the job that Dusty May has his heart set on, deep down, and he is not going to ever address it, while Michigan's season is still going. But if deep down as a kid in Bloomfield, this is, he dreamt of himself one day, in Bob Knight's shoes, that's what it comes down to. And if that's what he wants to make happen, I would think both sides can pretty easily find a way to make that happen.
Right. He says that when he became a manager at IU, his big dream was to be a high school coach in Indiana somewhere. So I'm guessing a lot of this is more than he can even really process at this point, because it's happened so fast since that Final Four run a few years ago. The recruiting angle is really unique with him too. You mentioned guys potentially coming with him, and it's even interesting, like, does a coach think about leaving a school differently now than he did a few years ago because of the transfer portal? Players can come and go freely and do every year. Why should a coach, think too much about it? Because, everybody's mobile. It used to be like the players would say, well, the coach can leave. Why can't we? And now, the coach can think, well, all the players are leaving. Why can't I? So that the whole notion of loyalty is a little bit out the window. But Michigan has a couple commits in the 2025 class that are pretty interesting from an IU perspective, because they're two kids that IU recruited. Grady Winters, prolific prep, like a 6'6" wing known for his shooting. And then Trey McKinney's like a 5-star. Probably, I watched him several times this summer, and was probably no player that I thought, man, that guy translates to the Big Ten better than anybody I saw. He's like a 6'4" wide body that can just, plays at his own pace and scores in all kinds of creative ways. I kind of see him being like that booty ball type player that we've seen a little bit of here lately. But I think he's going to be a stud wherever he plays coming up. It was a steal for Dusty May, really. He's from Flint. And you think of Flint guys going to Michigan State, and Dusty in his first year got him to go to Ann Arbor. So it speaks somewhat to his recruiting chops as well. And I'll even throw this out there. There's a guy in the 2025 class that I think everybody would immediately know his name if I said it, that, I have firsthand knowledge that, basically if Dusty was at IU, he was going to IU as well. So there's a lot of appeal with Dusty that goes beyond what he's done as a coach when it comes to, IU, whoever they have next year as a coach is going to have a rebuild roster wise. That's pretty clear. We've talked, Seth, about like over under on a number of players that would be back on the team next year. I think I said, could be 0. Nothing would surprise me. But they also have a lot of guys that could come back that could form a nice core or foundation. You think about like Mbako, Renew, Miles Rice. So that as soon as we get this coaching thing figured out, we're going to have a crazy time with the transfer portal, both coming and going. So it's not going to lose any steam here in terms of the amount of work we have to do to cover this whole thing. Who else are you guys hearing about, thinking about, intrigued by? I think we covered like the kind of the top 4 names that seem to be generating the most buzz. But is there anybody else? Yeah, you know, coincidence, use the word buzz there.
Hmm.
Is there anybody else that has you intrigued? I guess I'll go ahead since I mistakenly did that little segue. Buzz Williams has created some buzz. I think maybe the first time I saw him, anybody mention him with any level of seriousness was Greg Doyle of the Indy Star. And I read his article kind of with a condescending thought in my head, but he did a good job making the pitch anyway. But I think Buzz Williams has a really unique coaching resume that I don't think you see very often. He's like every 5-6 years he's jumped schools, and each school is kind of the similar type of program, like a mid high major, if that's even a thing. Like the schools are Marquette, Virginia Tech, Texas A&M. So it's not like he's like taking the latter approach where he's gone from low major, mid major, high major to an elite program. It's kind of the same kind of programs, which makes me think there's something unique there about him, that there's some backstory we don't know about why he's making these moves. I haven't really spent a lot of time investigating it, but what are your guys' thoughts about Buzz Williams as a potential candidate?
Yeah, I also kind of did some research on Williams, and kind of to your point, like the jumping from like kind of similar style, not style, like level of programs was jumped out to me. But he's got Texas A&M rolling this year.
Yeah.
I think they're still in the top 10 in the AP poll, unless I'm missing a loss that they recently had. But I would be a big fan of him if he came over. I don't know much about, I guess, his character, his past, or whatever, with stuff that you have to consider. But I think, if he, the only thing that worries me about that is that, like, if he made these stops at these kind of mid-level programs, what's, I guess, holding him back from moving up if that's the case? Because I mean, I was taking a look at his records. I mean, they're good. And there's plenty of NCAA tournament appearances, but is there a reason that there's like he's not moving up into that program, or is there a reason that there's something that I don't know. I think there's definitely plenty of accolades to go by, especially the NCAA tournament appearances, which IU fans love. As anytime they get into the tournament, you'll get appreciated. But I would be a big fan. I also wanted to touch on my personal favorite, Ben McCollum, which I know a lot of people have a lot of different opinions about, just because of how new he is to the Division I game. But he took, I think he's at Drake now, but he took a Division II program to so many Division II NCAA program championships. It's absurd. And he's been able to translate that into this year at Drake. So just wanted to throw that name out there. I know a lot of people have concerns about him just with recruiting at the high level, which makes sense, and coaching at the high level as well. But, had to throw his name in there at that point.
No, I think it's a great name. Great story. I think whether he would be hired by Indiana or whoever he's hired by, I think in the next 5 years, we're going to be talking about McCollum as either like the guy that got away or the guy that, from an Indiana perspective, good thing they didn't hire him, because he's clearly going to go high major here soon. And he is an Iowa City native, and a lot of people think Iowa's going to open up here. So I do think
that makes sense.
That's a
It
possibility.
would be a huge jump. I mean, from right now, considering from like the Drake to just finishing out his long Division II tenure, one season at Drake and then to Indiana, it's a huge reach. But I mean, the records from his season speak for themselves. So
yeah, four national titles in 6 years, and I think one of those ones he didn't win was the COVID year. So
yeah,
I mean, it's just nuts how successful he was. Seth, what do you got?
Yeah, I'll talk about Buzz Williams first. Just I don't know why we're saying that he's been at like small programs when he's coached Marquette, Virginia Tech, and Texas A&M. Those, not that those are blue bloods of college basketball or by any means, but I mean, those are all power programs. Marquette, particularly, I think I'd call a power program. Those are all, you're coaching in the Big East, the ACC, and the SEC. I mean,
well, I guess what I was trying to say, maybe inartfully, is I see those as all lateral moves. Like,
Yeah.
I don't think he ever like, okay, I proved myself at Marquette. Now I'm going to go to Virginia Tech. Kind of the same thing with Texas A&M, which may even be a step back from the other two. So that's what I was trying to say. It's just peculiar moves. I don't think that they're necessarily bad programs.
Yeah. Yeah. But I guess with Buzz, I would probably call him, to an extent, maybe Mick Cronin light, in terms of his results. Just, he's consistent. He's pretty consistent, with a little less consistency than Mick Cronin. But with those power teams, I mean, he's pretty consistently getting them to the NCAA tournament. He's winning games. He's got a couple of Sweet 16 appearances, I think. Let's see. He went to the Sweet 16 once with Virginia Tech. Twice. He had a good little run at Marquette. Doesn't have the Final Four appearance that Mick Cronin has, but I think you could do a lot worse than Buzz Williams. He's relatively consistent. It feels like once he's come into a program, he may need a year to kind of get it rolling, based on whatever situation he's walking into, but he's won everywhere he's been, seemingly. So I don't think that's a bad candidate. I mean, McCollum, y'all addressed that pretty cleanly. The name I'll throw out is from Texas Tech, Grant McCasland. I think he's a strong candidate. He's got Texas Tech rolling this year. They're number 8 in KenPom right now. And he took them to the tournament last year. And unlike some of these other candidates, it's not like he was walking into a broken program at Texas Tech. Like Texas Tech has, from Chris Beard to Mark Adams, they kind of established themselves as a consistently strong program over the last, decade, maybe not a full decade, but, 6-7 years, something like that. Like, they've established themselves as that sort of program, Texas Tech. So it's not like he had to rebuild much, but you go back to what he did at North Texas too. And when you look at the North Texas resume, it's really impressive what he was able to do there. And I mean, it almost reflects, well on him that North Texas is still doing pretty well even without him. Like, what he's, they're having a strong year this year. So it kind of speaks to that he built something sustainable that can keep rolling even after he left. And so, yeah, I mean, McCasland, I think, is just another name that, a lot of success there. I think you could reasonably question, with him, this is only his second year at Texas Tech, and he had never been at the power conference level before that. So you can reasonably question, okay, is this guy ready for the leap to the Indiana job right now? Do you want him to be more seasoned? But I mean, we're saying the same thing. It's hard to say that when we talk so much about Dusty May, who's completing his first season at the power conference level. So, it goes both ways, but I think McCasland is a strong candidate.
Yeah, I was really impressed with him when I was doing some research on him. One of the things that really popped out for me looking at his KenPom profile is, like, almost without exception, every year his team's one of the best 3-point shooting teams and one of the best at guarding the 3-point arc. So it's like the perfect, modern thing on both ends of the court. I know a lot of people say he's a Texas guy, who's like born and raised there, and it's never really coached out of the state. And I was reading an article in I don't know if it was Lubbock or somewhere in that area, local type paper, just talking about how ingrained he and his wife are locally. Seemed like trying to make the case that he would never leave. So I don't know that I'm sure you can find that kind of story with just about every coach if you try hard enough. People say, like, who's the Kurt Signetti of this search? Like, to me, he might be the closest, because I don't think McCollum's kind of proven enough at D1, whereas McCasland's done what he's done at D1. And, to your point, Seth, kind of like Signetti at JMU, who was already really good at football, he even elevated it a step further. It kind of seems like that's what McCasland's doing right now. So I really like him as a prospect, but we'll see if Indiana goes that route. Always one of the big storylines when there's a coaching search is who else has a coaching search going on. And that has a major impact on and ultimately who you're able to get. Right now, I perhaps biased, but I feel like Indiana has the strongest opening right now. The only other schools, and you guys can jump in here if I'm wrong, but I think Virginia, Miami, and Florida State are the only three that I'm aware of from a high major standpoint at this point in time. And I would say Indiana, for a number of reasons, is going to be more attractive than those three. Are you guys hearing of any others? And would you agree with that sentiment?
I mean, I think at this time, anything that I would think is most likely speculative, just with how teams are performing heading into, the latter stages of the Big Ten, or not just the Big Ten, just wherever they're playing. But I mean, for those four programs that you mentioned, I think Indiana is probably the strongest head coaching open in terms of its resources. Now, people may argue, oh, Miami's probably has a lot of like NIL resources and stuff like that, which they do, but it's probably not all, through their basketball program, which hasn't been, the powerful, program at that school. So it was, I think it's safe to say Indiana probably is the strongest open right now. It's just kind of finding through this search, like who is going to use the resources all together, whether it be NIL, facilities, recruiting, stuff like that. Who's going to utilize that the most and in the best way to kind of rebuild the program?
Yeah, and set the two programs that could change the dynamics of everything we just said. There's some North Carolina buzz with Hubert Davis, and even recently some Kansas buzz. That situation's getting a little bit weird. I think they suffered maybe their worst loss of the Bill Self era, down by 40 at one point the other night. Crazy. They just don't seem like the same program, and sometimes when that happens, it's a red flag that the coach might kind of be checking out a little bit. I don't know, that's purely speculative, but there's a lot of people speculating about that right now. If not this year, how much longer is he going to go? I think he had a health scare a couple of years ago, if I remember right. So, if either one of those opened up, that completely changes things for Indiana.
Yeah. One other school that may not be at those levels, and this is not me hearing anything. This is just kind of, well, my younger brother went to this school, so I hear about them maybe a disproportionate amount, but things are getting a little rocky in Syracuse, New York. And if Syracuse entered the coaching market too, I think that's another school that, is probably similar to Indiana, and to where they're not going to be seen at the same level as the North Carolina or the Kansas job, but are still going to be seen as, one of the better jobs available, across the country.
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Good point.
Interesting. Okay, Seth, you warmed up, you got your caffeine, you're ready to roll, because I want to talk about diverge here a little bit into
Just gonna sit back and get a snack real quick.
Mike Woodson has not done any radio appearances pregame, postgame, and now his weekly radio show. He's pretty clearly completely checked out of all of it. Doesn't intend to do any in the future. I listened to a couple Don Fisher interviews earlier this week. He thinks that he doesn't know for sure, but he thinks it might be personal. Like Woodson's mad at him for something. I'm not really sure, but what's your reaction to how he's handling this?
I mean, look, I wrote a good amount about this after the UCLA game. Was it? Hi, Ollie. I wrote a lot about this after the UCLA game, and let's be clear here, because I know what I've seen all the comments on social media. It's not anything personal, with me, and it's not that I feel personally slighted or anything. It's not, I'm not personally worse off or anything by Mike Woodson's behavior. But I think what's most troubling is it's just the story around IU basketball right now could easily just be the team has played better over the last 3 games. They've gone 1-2, but generally they've played better for the most part of the last 3 games since they announced Woodson's, departure at the end of the season. The story could easily be, the team is rallying around this. It's kind of freed up Woodson to change some things and not have to worry about, how it's going to impact the future. He's just kind of out there focused on this year and this year alone. That could easily be the story, but all of this sideshow is just distracting from it. And it's just, it's not how he's handling the media. It's that's his way to re-endear himself to the fans. Unless you're going to go out and win every single game the rest of the way, that's your way to re-endear yourself to the fans on your way out. And I have a feeling that Woodson wants, I don't know if he expects or demands like a proper send-off for standing ovation or whatever as a program legend. But to a certain extent, it feels like he's entitled to, something like that, as a program legend, as, somebody who came home and, has not had a total failure of a tenure at IU. It feels like he wants to have that kind of proper send-off, but he's just shown no interest in re-endearing himself to everybody around IU basketball that, would be responsible for making that happen, whether it's the media, speaking favorably about him, whether it's the fans warming back up to him after they were booing him for so long. It's like he's just coming out and giving even shorter, even more bland statements for the most part. He has to know that he's not going to get in anybody's good graces by turning down Don Fisher and leaving Don Fisher hanging. He has to know that that's going to make some people upset. Right. And it's just, it's just going to every time that he keeps doing this, and continues to behave like this, not to mention also the cutting off player access to the media after losses is a terrible look. Right. And clearly it's only after losses because he let Malik Renew talk after they won at Michigan State. And and that just sends the message that, he's telling the players that they're allowed to bask in the glory of victory, but they don't have to face the music and they don't have to be accountable when things don't go well. And that's if you as a college basketball coach are running a program that's trying to mold players into good men outside of the game, that's a terrible message to send. That's just a terrible message to send. And not to mention, like with that, after the Illinois game, the biggest disaster game of the season from IU's perspective, that Illinois, catastrophe here, we can call it. Luke Goody and Anthony Leal went in there and represented IU as well as they could under the circumstances. And I know people thought, there were some people that thought that, they didn't and are reading, deeply into, certain comments that they made within that press conference. But reasonably, there's only so much they could say. And they, came out and grabbed accountability and took it by the horns and, gave as strong of a message there and represented IU as well as they could have. And it's like you watch that and you just have to ask yourself, how much worse can these players be making a situation right now? They can't. And so it's just all, and it seems to be Woodson's decision to be cutting that off too. So it's just all adding up and it's just creating this unnecessary sideshow for, and let's not lose sight of the fact also that, is he really going to keep doing this if Indiana plays their way back onto the bubble of the tournament? Like, they're, still sitting in like next 4 out categories of some bracketology. Is he really going to keep acting like this if they play their way into the tournament? Like, what if they get into the NCAA? What if they play their way into the NCAA tournament and he's still going out there refusing to talk to Don Fisher? It's just creating such a sideshow to the end of this season when Woodson could easily be spinning this into a way for him to ride off into the sunset.
Well, the funny thing is, if they make the NCAA and even the Big Ten, they're going to be obligated to, both he and the players to talk to the media. So you can run, but you can't hide, I guess. But, look, I think we all know, and this is going to sound like I'm taking a shot at him. I'm not. It's just reality. Mike Woodson was only hired in this job because he was a former player. His resume didn't rise to the level of the job otherwise. And he's said on a regular basis over the last 4 years that he cares a lot about this program and wants what's best for the program. Well, I've got news for him. What's best for the program right now at this moment is to be an ambassador for the future, for the next guy. And what this program doesn't need more than anything else is more negativity and more turmoil. And, it might be relatively minor, but, having a little spat with Don Fisher just isn't what anybody needs right now. So, nobody's asking me, but that would be my advice, is just to get over it and do we're talking about like 2 and 3 minute little sound bites before games and after games. Yeah. The weekly show's a little bit longer, but come on. I don't think we all know Don Fisher to varying degrees, as do most of the fans out there, at least listening to him. I will tell anybody that's listening, he's pretty much the exact same guy as he comes across on the radio. He's a great guy, very authentic. If he said anything that pissed Woodson off, it was not meant maliciously. It was just kind of coming out in the moment. So it's just a bunch of silliness, really.
And to the point about the player access after losses and everything, I've seen plenty of comments saying that they they shouldn't have to talk after losses, and you guys have torn them apart all season. Why should they want to talk to you? And it's like, I can't speak for everybody that covers Indiana. I can't speak for everybody that writes, does content around this team. And surely there are some people that have acted in bad faith. But I think for the most part, the people who, I think the loudest voices that cover this team, and I think the loudest, most prominent, and I think the most present, I'll say, voices that cover this team, I think are generally fair. Yeah. And that doesn't mean not criticizing anybody ever, but I think generally the people that cover this team are fair about it. And people were not ripping them apart in September. People were not going into Hoosier hysteria, criticizing the play in the scrimmage, like in the Hoosier hysteria scrimmage, saying, "Oh, this team isn't going to do anything this year." That people that are saying that happened. And again, I'm not saying that nobody did that, because it might have happened. And I'm not out there reading every single article that was written about this team all season long. I'm not speaking for everybody. I'm just saying the vast majority of the media are treating people fairly here and are not out to get anybody. And people that are convincing themselves otherwise are being very tribalistic right now and just convincing themselves of something that's not happening.
Yeah, I think that's fair. Owen, does this topic, is it kind of generating any buzz or, being talked about amongst the student media very much?
Yeah, I mean, we're taking a class right now with Mike Wells, who's a great guy, history with ESPN, covering the Colts, stuff like that. Now a professor at IU. Funny enough, we're actually just finishing up the 30 for 30 on last days of night, which is pretty cool. And we're having to write an analysis piece on it. And a lot of the other student media guys that cover the basketball team are in there. And it's really, it's kind of pretty much Seth had it spot on. Like, this is an issue that it could have been avoided a long time ago, first of all, but also it's just spun out into this mix of, Mike Woodson avoiding all these radio shows and people having opinions about that, but also people putting it on like the media presence and how that's affected the team and how that all weighs down on the team continuously throughout the season. So especially when you see some of the comments on some of the like student reporters teams, or not teams, like articles and stories and stuff like that. And it's kind of, I'm not going to speak for the whole fan base here, but it's really, it's not the best. I mean, social media has its ups and downs, and IU basketball social media has really been on a down train lately, especially with a lot of negativity. But with the student media and the reporters, it's trying to navigate that process because we're all kind of up and coming and trying to figure out how to deal with that. But also, it's really, it's new for them, but it's just a weird atmosphere right now, and it's one that it will definitely look different the next season when it comes around, but it's just trying to navigate it through the end of the season. That's been weird.
And weird is a good segue into what I want to talk about, our final topic, which is the game on Sunday. you got,
Yeah.
you've got, as Seth, you alluded to, Indiana is still, kind of right on the bubble. Strangely enough, at 15-11, and probably no game would boost their resume more than this game against Purdue on Sunday. But interestingly enough, Purdue is going to come in on their first 3-game losing streak in 5 years. So pre-Zach Edey, basically. They've been looking very, going back to the IU game, really very pedestrian, I guess would be one way to describe it. Clearly a team that has its own share of issues. And kind of not having Edey seems to be at the core of it, because they don't have the rim protection this year. They don't have, Trey Kaufman-Renn has been great. Braden Smith has been great, but they don't have quite the dominant force that they've had in years past. I I guess, we all know how that first game went at Mackey. I thought that was one of Indiana's best games of the season, irrespective of the fact that they lost. For both of you guys, the fact that Purdue is struggling, and obviously there's a lot of pride in that program. What do you guys expect on Sunday, given the dynamics at play at both programs right now?
Well, I'll kind of go ahead and speak for myself. I think the game, especially for students, has been marketed pretty well, as they're trying to get people in the stadium. I think Papa John's just said something about lining up early, and
That's
they're
right.
going to get free pizza or something like that. So, it's kind of one of those situations where, like, all the talk can happen before, like, all the noise and stuff, it kind of weighs down. But once that game tips off, it's rivalry, and it's just game versus game. Nothing else matters. No record, no outstanding coaching changes happening at the year, no struggle heading into the game. It's just IU versus Purdue. And I think that's an atmosphere that you can kind of expect maybe heading into Sunday. I know a lot of my friends are going to the game regardless if they haven't been to the past few games as roommates and as students. They've just skipped out on it, but they're just waiting for Purdue to happen just so they can, see the rivalry game. So I think kind of like I said, I think all the noise and all the chatter with all the struggles that Purdue may be having, all the, interesting stuff going on here, it just kind of ends when that tips off. So I wouldn't be surprised to see, Assembly Hall maybe generate sold out crowd. I don't know if that would be, too drastic to say, but I think there's a good chance for it.
Seems like they'll be pretty close. I wouldn't be surprised if there's some empties in the corners of the balconies, right. But I suspect it'll be close. Seth, it will also be interesting if Woodson can get this win. He'll end up 3-3 against Purdue, despite this kind of being one of the best runs in the history of the Purdue program, which is kind of just a funny side note to everything else that's going on.
Yeah, and I mean, it would be. You have to figure that there's motivation in him for that. The IU guy that clearly understands this rivalry and knows, the meaning of this rivalry within the state of Indiana. And the guy whose IU tenure as of now is pretty, is going to be most well known for ending that long slump against Purdue in general, and ending the long drought at Mackey. I mean, sweeping that 2023 Purdue team is a big part of Mike Woodson's legacy in Bloomington. So I'm sure that, I mean, obviously, there's the outside chance that they meet in the Big Ten tournament, or even more outside chance of the NCAA. But, outside of something like that happening, this is his last time going up against Purdue as IU head coach. And you have to figure that he himself is going to be motivated to go out on the right note with that. Now, look, I mean, Purdue is probably going to see what happened in that last game. Obviously, they know what's happened to them the last several games and come in ready to try to flip this thing around. But I think, like I've said a bunch of times, it has to give IU confidence. The fact that they played that well against Purdue, going into a rematch against them, it's like they know that they can, put themselves in position to beat that team. They have to know that. And so, like I say about so many of IU's other games, it just depends on what version of IU comes out on Sunday. If it's the team that, plays with their food a little bit for the first 5-10 minutes of the game, if it's the team that waits until, it's been a theme, even as they played well the last few games, it's just been a growing theme that this team comes out and it starts slow, but then, has a really nice run to begin the second half. Maybe the first 5 to 8 minutes of the second half, they seem to kind of look resurgent. That's how the UCLA game went. And I think it just depends on what version of IU comes out. If it's the version that played up in West Lafayette, they'll have a good chance to pull this off. But, they just can't afford to be wasteful with their opportunities.
And don't forget that even though they played so well up there, they had 20 turnovers in that game. So they could have probably won going away if they had been able to take care of the basketball. I think after the game, Painter noted that, the Galloway and Baco Goody combination with Ballo setting ball screens he just acknowledged that was very hard to deal with. So we've seen a lot of that lineup since. So it is going to be an interesting game. And it will, like I said, if Indiana wins it, they're going to be right there in the conversation for making the NCAA, which is just wild to think about, with a much more manageable schedule the rest of the way. Penn State, Washington, Oregon, Ohio State. There's a potential to get on a run. It wouldn't be dissimilar to what they did last year when they were playing awful and then out of nowhere won 5 in a row, counting the first game of the Big Ten tournament. So stranger things have happened. We'll see how it goes. But guys, I think we'll wrap it up right there. Until this time next week. Presumably, we still won't have a new coach, so we'll should have plenty to talk about, including how that Purdue game went. So for Seth Tao, Owen Graham, I am Mike Schumann for East 17th Street. We will catch you all in the next time.